and welcome to Life at Noon. My name is Rachel Hugenberg. I am one of the reference librarians here at Lone Star Sci-Fair, and I am very excited this morning because we have Rachel Folkerts from Plant It Forward. She is their Farms Programs Manager, and she is actually here to talk with us today about Plant It Forward, the organization itself, as well as Houston Foodways. She has a BA in environmental science from Washington University and served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Senegal, and has also been working for nonprofits for some time, I believe, and one of those is the great Houston Center to Plant It Forward. So, Rachel, if you would please go on ahead and kick us off.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thanks to the Harris County Public Library for inviting me here to speak on behalf of Plant It Forward today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so I am thrilled to get to share with you a little bit about the work that we do at Plant It Forward. And during this presentation, I am going to brag about all of the great things that the new American farmers at Plant It Forward are doing to revitalize our foodways. But first, I want to situate all of us inside of the legacy that we've inherited in our food and farming systems. And it's not a particularly great legacy. This is a story of environmental destruction, of systemic racism, and it luckily is one that turns out to have a good ending. So bear with me through some of this context, and remember that we are today charting a new path for Houston's foodways. So I want to start by grounding us inside of the history of race and immigration, specifically in US agriculture. So we're going to look at this from the perspective of white American farmers, Black American farmers, and Latino American farmers. So when we're looking at the history of white Americans in farming, this is first a history that I think we all know is predicated on taking land from the indigenous people of the US. And this was something that was done explicitly, violently over generations in the United States. Simultaneously, during this time, the US government set a series of policies that enabled white farmers to acquire land. One of these was the Homestead Act of 1862, and that act allotted white farmers with 160 acres of land as their homestead. And that was something that my own family benefited from. So my family arrived in the late 1800s from Germany and settled at a farm in Illinois. And my grandpa was part of a wave of people in the 40s through the 80s who sought urban opportunities, right? They left the farm seeking different lifestyles, different opportunities in our cities. And we'll talk about this here in a few minutes, but this was the time period in US farming where things got bigger, things got more expensive for the farmer, and food got a lot cheaper. This was the Earl Butz adapt or die time period, and many farmers did exit the industry, and including my own family in this time period. And today, recently, my family sold the family farm in Illinois, and my grandpa inherited $1 million from this farming legacy. So this is a specific example, but an illustration of how the legacy of our agricultural system and agricultural policy has affected the descendants of farmers, including my own family. Now, if we consider a Black family in the US, I don't think I need to convince anyone that they had a very different experience. So Black Americans were brought over beginning in 1619 and lasting through the end of the Civil War in 1865, were enslaved and forcibly shipped to the US to work in our agriculture sector. Our cotton and sugar industries depended on enslaved labor. And that is a legacy that we know that we continue to live with to this day. So during the Reconstruction period, briefly after the Civil War, there was a dream of 40 acres and a mule. So briefly, the US government considered enacting a policy that would give formerly enslaved peoples 40 acres of land so that they could begin their own farms. And I think it's worth pointing out that simultaneously, the US government was giving 160 acres, 4 times the amount of land, to white settlers. So even in this best version of events, there's systemic racism baked in. Now, of course, 40 acres and a mule didn't happen. This dream died with Reconstruction. And rather, what happened was we created a system of sharecropping and tenant farming. And if you're not familiar with what sharecropping was, it was basically a system where farm workers, typically Black farm workers, would grow crops on typically a white farm owner's property, and ostensibly they were given, a share of the profits, but in practice, this was a very exploitative labor system that ensured that the sharecroppers were not able to accumulate their own wealth or advance their own farms, their own lives. And as an illustration of this, we can see that in 1900, 64% of white farmers owned, operated, or managed their own land, compared to just 25% of Black farmers. So during this period that lasted through the 1940s, it's clear that while enslavement as an institution was over, there continued to be a system of exploiting Black labor inside of our agricultural systems. Then moving into the 1940s to the 1970s, this was the period of the Great Migration, where rural Southern Black Americans decided that they had had enough of the unjust treatment in the farming system, and they were moving into urban areas and into the North, seeking new lifestyles. So again, this was happening concurrently with a significant exodus in white communities as well, from into urban areas, away from rural areas. Although in the case of Black Americans, the drivers were more pernicious. And then today, of course, we have not left this legacy behind us. Since I'm attuned to this world, I can tell you that I see headlines every week talking about how Black farmers are continuing to lose land. They're disproportionately denied the financing that they need to operate and advance their farms. This is something that is very much alive today and that you can see in land ownership. I believe it's 98% of land in the US is owned by white farmers. So because of this legacy of systemic racism, very little farmland in the US is owned today by people of color. All right. And finally, I want to give a brief background on the history of a Latino American farmer and what they might have experienced inside of the US food and farming systems. So beginning in World War I, the US government needed additional agriculture labor, and this was an era of overall very restrictionist immigration policies where many groups of immigrants were being denied entry into the US, but an exception was made for Mexican workers who were considered to be a special class of labor who could never permanently settle, and they could be called in and exported at will. And that is, language that was spoken in the US House and Senate when these bills were being passed. And so this explicit racialization of specifically Mexicans as a racialized and migrant workforce started to be born in the World War I era. And again, these are policies that were driven by the demands of labor in agriculture. So in the 1940s, the US government with Mexico introduced the Bracero program, which was an agreement between those two governments that allowed Mexican workers to legally cross the border into the US to work in agribusiness, and this was all done on a temporary basis. These workers were regularly exploited and denied pay and had no legal recourse. And the program was used strategically by agribusiness to undercut their wages and rights that were demanded by US-born workers. So in 1935, the US government passed the National Labor Relations Act that guaranteed certain minimum protections to workers, including the right to unionize, the right to collectively bargain. Notably, the agriculture industry was excluded from this labor agreement. And it wasn't until 1975, 40 years later, when the United Farm Workers, that was led by Cesar Chavez, won the right for farm workers to unionize. So there is a long history in agriculture of systemically undercutting agricultural wages, and in order to do that, we created a racialized identity for Mexican and other Central American farmers. And today, this legacy continues. If you buy produce at a typical supermarket that comes from California or cherries from the Pacific Northwest, really any conventionally grown produce from the US, it is a very good bet that it was grown by Mexican and Central American farm workers who are paid far below minimum wage. And these farm workers continue to be marginalized. They continue to be denied legal status and denied basic worker protections that we don't allow in other industries, but do continue to allow and perpetuate inside of our agricultural systems. Deep breath. All right, so this is our very brief history of race and immigration in agriculture. And now we're going to talk about the other ways that we've broken our foodways and the ways that we've destroyed our ecosystems through industrial agriculture practices. And I want everyone to just, bear in mind that within this context, we're also operating inside of the legacy that we just briefly reviewed of systemic racism. So if you find yourself saying agriculture isn't broken, what's broken in agriculture, here is the SparkNotes version. So first, it is scientific consensus that industrial agriculture is driving ecosystem collapse, and cheap food is driving farmers out of business and perpetuating environmentally unsustainable and unethical practices, including the labor practices that we just discussed. And this isn't just about farmers, right? Our community is also suffering when good food becomes inaccessible. So when I say that this scientific consensus, that industrial agriculture practices are driving ecosystem collapse, I'll say that this is something that isn't disputed. Any Nature review paper that you see, any report from the International Panel on Climate Change, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, Conservation International, the World Wildlife Foundation, really take your pick of body of scientists. And there is clear consensus that many of the practices of industrial agriculture are harming biodiversity, harming our planet's ecosystems. And I'll emphasize that this isn't something that is just happening, out there in the Amazon, in Africa, in India. No, this is happening to us here in the US. I'm guessing everybody knows more or less what a red tide is. This is, an algal bloom that will happen in the Gulf, and it happens when one of the main drivers is fertilizer runoff from our agricultural fields. So nitrogen-rich fertilizer runs off into our oceans, and algae loves it, grows like mad, eats it up, and that creates inside of the ocean an oxygen depleted environment. And that's where you see in this image, many, many, many tons of dead fish, dead wildlife. And this is a direct result of agricultural pollution. And that's just one example of the ways in which the practices of industrial agriculture are in fact harmful to our planet. So to very briefly explain the mechanisms here, when we talk about industrial scale agriculture, we're talking about monocultured landscapes, right? Where I grew up in Iowa, the entire state is covered in two crops, corn and soybeans. And when you have an entire landscape that is dominated by one or two or three crops, you have what we call a monoculture, and that essentially prohibits biodiversity. It prohibits biodiversity in the soil and in the surrounding agro ecosystem. And we also, to cultivate these monocultured landscapes, we rely on use of synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, and synthetic herbicides. And high level, this is a pretty intuitive concept in a natural system. You're going to have lots of biodiversity, many different interactions within the ecosystem, and everything will be able to ebb and flow, balance each other out. Where there's a pest, there's a predator. But when we cultivate a landscape that is just one thing, now those natural processes, the wildlife that might live inside of a diverse ecosystem, that's not going to be there. There's not going to be natural predators for our pests. So we're going to bring in a pesticide, we're going to bring in an herbicide so we can, increase scale, increase efficiency, better control this environment. And it turns out that that has truly ruinous effects on soil microbiota, and everything is based in our soil. So all that, dearth of diverse soil microbiota just percolates throughout the entire ecosystem and, results in a lot of problems. There's a lot of talk about the loss of bees, right? And this is a result of industrial agriculture. And again, it's just one example of the way in which these growing practices, these landscape management practices are driving ecosystem collapse. In addition, our use of synthetic fertilizers are contributing pretty significantly to anthropogenic, so human-made greenhouse gas emissions. In total, agriculture accounts for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, and changes in land use practices that include diversifying crop production and reintroducing biodiversity into our agricultural practices. This is always something that's talked about on the reports released by the International Panel on Climate Change. It is a consensus view that the way we farm needs to change and will be critically important to saving biodiversity and reversing or halting the negative effects of climate change. Now, if you're thinking, why are our farmers doing this? Why don't they change their practices? I would say, as someone who has spent her entire career working with farmers, that farmers are good people who know the land, who care deeply about the land. They know that their land is their inheritance, is their family's inheritance. You won't find a farmer who doesn't know that biodiversity is hurting, that our landscapes are changing, and often not for the better. But farmers are trapped. They're not ignoring the problems. They don't have good tools to fix these problems. We have seen a huge increase in the cost of farming, and farm bankruptcies continue to rise. Farmers are rapidly going out of business, particularly farmers who do try to implement sustainable and ethical practices. And we have an aging farming population. So average age of farmers right now is about 58 years old. And the next generation, their kids, they're saying, we don't want to farm. There's not enough money in it. It's too much work. And we're continuing the trend of the exodus from rural America. So farmers today who are retiring, they are going bankrupt. They're losing their land. They're losing their livelihood. They're losing their agrarian way of life. And they are watching the landscape that they have done their best to cultivate, to take care of for the next generation. They are seeing this destroyed. And this is a direct consequence of cheap food. Now, cheap food isn't necessarily the villain. We created policies. The whole point of the Green Revolution was to lower the price of food and ensure that we had enough food to feed a growing global population. There are good reasons why we intentionally set out to lower the price of food, but it has come with huge negative consequences for our farmers, for our planet, and for our communities. So today, US families spend less than 10% of their disposable income on food. In 1960, it was 17%. And then if we are thinking about 1900, it would have been maybe a third of disposable income spent on food. So in relative terms, food has never been cheaper. But that means for farmers, and particularly thinking about farmers who are trying to be responsible land stewards, who are using sustainable practices, using ethical practices, they lose money farming. And they have been losing money, according to one study in Southern Arizona, since 1989, which encompasses my entire lifetime. So this is not a new trend in farming. It is not a short-term trend in farming. This is an entrenched, systemic, deeply concerning problem. And again, this shouldn't be something that is a concern only if you're a farmer, because farmers are the primary stewards of our land. And when they suffer, when they are not able to practice sustainable agriculture, our planet suffers, which we've talked about, and our communities suffer. So today, as a consequence of what we grow and of the low cost, historically speaking, of food, we are seeing an increase in the prevalence of diet-related chronic diseases like diabetes and heart disease. In fact, now heart disease is the leading cause of death in the US. And we also know, this graph here is an illustration of this from the CDC, but it is disproportionately communities of color who are affected by lack of access to healthy food. So while food in general is cheap and abundant, healthy food like fresh fruits and vegetables is not accessible to many in our communities. And that is driving significant health disparities and having obvious negative effects on how we can live and on our ability to thrive. And in this example, we're looking at the increased prevalence of diabetes. And finally, I'll just note that connecting to green space, being in nature, and I certainly include agroecosystems as part of nature, is something that is in our blood and bones as humans. And when we are disconnected from nature, that has real consequences. This chart here is a study that shows the negative effect on mental health of being disconnected from green space. So there are, in summary, many problems in our food and farming systems, and we have inherited a system that needs to change. But remember, there is a good ending to this story, and we are getting there. So at Plant It Forward, we work with New American farmers, and New American refers to folks who weren't born in the US, right? So immigrants and refugees. And we are very lucky in the US to be a country filled with diverse perspectives, with people from diverse backgrounds, and to welcome many new Americans into our country every year. And luckily for us, for our food and farming systems, they have very important new perspectives to offer us. So New American farmers are showing us how to farm sustainably. And that's because many New Americans come from countries that still use traditional farming systems, and traditional farming systems tend to use more sustainable practices. And again, New American farmers, they come to us knowing these systems. And while we are out of practice, haven't been using these practices in agriculture since about the 1970s, that isn't true in other countries. And we are very lucky that they want to come here and teach us how to fix our farming systems. We talked about how our current farming population in the US is retiring, and we don't have enough US born farmers who want to replace them. But we do have many new Americans who grew up in an agrarian community and who want to return to that kind of lifestyle. This is just one data point, but illustrates the desire among refugee and immigrant populations to farm. So 89% of refugees in a survey done in King County, Washington, which is where Seattle is, 89% expressed a desire to farm. Now, I'm not suggesting that of the entire population of new Americans that is true, but certainly it seems that more so than young US born people, this is a population who want to farm. And again, in general, we need more farmers. And then if we're thinking about organic and sustainable farming, the demand right now outstrips the supply. So we need these farmers, and new Americans are ready and eager to do it. And I'll just say to this point, I often, through my work with Plant It Forward, speak with folks across the country who run farmer training programs. And lots of these programs work with anyone who wants to farm. But the observation time and time again is that while young Americans might do well in the classes and might do well farming for a couple of years, young US born people tend to leave because they say, just like the kids of the current generation of farmers, they're saying there's not enough money, it's too much work, I'm not staying in it. But for new Americans, they really strongly desire the lifestyle, and they have the will, the grit, the determination to stick with farming. New Americans are also increasing agricultural biodiversity. So while half of the cropland in the US is corn and soybeans, which is incredible, full 50% of all of our farms are two things. But when you go to the fields of new American farmers, you, for the most part, are going to see very biodiverse fields with mini crops being cultivated inside of small spaces, and often they're growing crops from their childhoods, and in that way introducing biodiversity into our farming systems here in the US. So I have a couple of quotes from a great book by Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern called The New American Farmer. And these are from the words of farmers, why they're choosing to farm. So Catalina in Virginia is saying, life in the United States is very, very ugly. Each person stays in their own house. There is no time. People live by their watch, and there's a lot of stress. In contrast, on her farm, she says, it's a bit like Mexico. It makes me feel the same. It's not the same exactly, but more free. In the city, there's more pressure. Then Mateo in California says, I like the life of a farmer. I don't necessarily recommend it. You have to love agriculture. You need to love farming more than you love money. One of the first things is that you have to love this. You can't do it for the money. That is part of farming. So for Catalina and Mateo and many new Americans, it is their dream to farm, to return to the agrarian lifestyle that they grew, that they experienced and loved in their home country. And that is a dream that the farmers that we work with at Plant It Forward share, and one that our organization has worked for the past 10 years to enable. So Plant It Forward was established in 2011, and our mission is to empower refugees to develop sustainable farm businesses that provide fresh and healthy food to our community. We envision a future where farmers are thriving and enriching Houston's vibrant culture. So what that means for us is that we are a network of 13 farmers. All of them arrived as refugees, and they are working on 8 independent farms in urban Houston. We have 4 farm sites that collectively encompass 6 acres. And, specifically thinking about what we do, we have, this pyramid of supports needed to lead to farmer success. It's ultimately, what we want is thriving farmers. So farmer education, that means making sure that farmers know what they can grow for Houston markets and know regionally specific appropriate practices for growing those crops. While our farmers come to us with agriculture experience, the climate of Houston, the soil in Houston, the markets in Houston are different from their home countries, and that's what our farmer education program focuses on. We also have our enterprise program, so that's ensuring that farmers have access to fair markets, right? We talked about how farmers who use sustainable practices lose money and it's driving them out of business. And our farmers are not an exception to that. But because we're a nonprofit, we are able to use our nonprofit food hub to bolster their businesses and to effectively subsidize the cost of farming so that our farmers can make enough money to stay in business. And that is the primary goal of our enterprise programs. And finally, last but definitely not least, we help farmers access land. This is the biggest barrier to entry for any farmer. It requires a lot of capital to start a farm, and getting access to land is a huge expense that all farmers have to bear. And that is something that our organization works with farmers and with community partners to connect people who want to farm with land where they can farm. And again, we are doing this because we know that in our country, farmers in general are not in a good place, but we believe that farmers are the key to transforming our food systems. And by ensuring their success, we at Plant It Forward are driving multifaceted community benefits. So we have at Plant It Forward 13 farmers, and these guys are, the heroes of the story, the stars of the show. Our farmers come from 3 different countries: the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Liberia. And Plant It Forward has trained farmers from a handful of other African countries. And again, all of the farmers at Plant It Forward arrived through the UN refugee program, which means that all of our farmers were forced to flee their homeland because of war, violence, or persecution. And our farmers were part of the lucky 1% of refugees who resettle permanently to a third country like the US that offers a permanent path towards citizenship or permanent residency. So our farmers along their journey have lived in many different countries: Russia, Gabon, Uganda, Kenya, to name a few. And they come to us with experience as medical professionals, as human rights activists, as farmers, as farmer educators. And I am privileged to work with them every day and to see them share their incredible talent, skills, and knowledge with Houston, and to enrich Houston and to make our communities and our foodways stronger. We have 4 farms, and to make sure everyone's looking at this map right, this is the 610 loop. So we're most of our farms are between the 610 loop and Beltway 8. We have, and collectively these farms encompass 6 acres, and our farmers operate 8 independent farms. So some of these folks farm as a team. So the Numas are a mother-daughter team, and then we have 3 sets of husband and wife farming teams. So Sama and Anriette, Alamasi, Fatuma, and Bora and Matranya are all farming couples. So when I talk about the multifaceted benefits that Plant It Forward is delivering through the work that our farmers are doing, this is what I mean. We are building a legacy for the next generation of Houstonians. In 10 years, we have sold over $3 million in fresh produce sales. And as a result of that, 3 Plant It Forward farmer families are proud homeowners, and our farmers and their families are pursuing their own education by through, there's been over 10 high school and post-secondary degrees. 5 members of our farmer families are currently pursuing a degree, and that includes 4 active U.S. military service members. The work that Plant It Forward is doing alongside these farmers is reshaping Houston's foodways, are bending this system towards greater social justice and community solidarity. We're enriching biodiversity, and we're promoting thoughtful environmental stewardship. One of the ways that we've done this is by introducing thousands of Houstonians to seasonal eating, to local food. And our farmers have brought new, healthy, delicious, and climatically appropriate crops to Houston. So here we have pictured malokia, sugarcane, lemongrass, roselle hibiscus, which is used to make a very delightful tea, and sunchokes. In partnership with Urban Harvest, we offer discounted farm shares to SNAP beneficiaries. And we do that to ensure that this high quality fresh food is financially accessible to everyone in our community. We are also teaching and showing students, farm neighbors, and community members what it means to cultivate a working landscape. And I can't tell you the number of times that I have seen someone visit our farm and just be delighted. People love to see the farm, to work in the farm. Kids often have no idea what they're looking at. Well, kids and adults, honestly, people kind of intuitively love it, and also have clearly not learned what it means to grow. And this is something that we're really proud at Plant It Forward to be able to offer the community. And of course, one of the most rewarding parts of working at Plant It Forward, interacting with our farmers, is to see the friendships that they are forming, the welcome that Houston is giving them, and the just beautiful interactions across diverse cultures that happen daily at Plant It Forward. And you are invited and very welcome to join the sustainable agriculture and local food movement, to join us at Plant It Forward. We are working to create a better legacy for the next generation than the one that we inherited. And where you put your dollars matters. How you spend your money, every dollar that I spend, I know, is a vote for the world that I want to create. And that can be a heavy burden to bear. But at Plant It Forward, I think we make it a little easier. So you can give directly to the organization to support the systemic change that we are driving. And you can support farms and local food directly by purchasing our produce. And that is how we will collectively create this thriving local food economy. You can also volunteer your time and talent. We need volunteers to work every week with our farmers at farmers markets, to lead farm work days, to participate in farm work days. If you're interested in the nonprofit side of the work, there's plenty of opportunities there. And actually tonight I'll be hosting a volunteer orientation. So those happen monthly, and you're most welcome to visit this link and sign up for an upcoming volunteer orientation and get involved with our work. You can also share our story, and this is incredibly important to connect with us on social media and to talk directly to your community about our work. And I have finally a list of resources if you'd like to learn more about these topics. The New American Farmer is a book that, as the title suggests, talks about the role of New Americans in our farming system today, and the struggles that they have. English Pastoral Inheritance by James Rebanks. This is the story of an English farmer who is starting to turn to regenerative agriculture practices, and the story of his family's experience farming really over the last 3 generations. David Attenborough recently released a documentary film, A Life on Our Planet, that talks about the role of industrial agriculture in ecosystem collapse. Would highly recommend. And then we have Farming While Black, Soul Fire Farms, Practical Guide to Liberation on the Land. If you're interested in learning more about the legacy of systemic racism in our farming system and be inspired by the work that Black farmers are doing to change that story. And then finally, if you're interested in learning more about where, the countries where most of our farmers come from, which, the Congo countries, I would recommend Advancing in the Glory of Monsters, The Collapse of Congo and the Great War in Africa by Jason Stearns. And with that, I am going to open it up for questions.
So I noticed on your all's website that there are ways to get it delivered with the food boxes, that it functions as a CSA as well.
Yeah, so the primary way to purchase from us is through, a farm box, also called a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, which is effectively a weekly subscription to the farm, and you pay in advance for anywhere between 1 week and 1 year, and then get a share portion of what is seasonally available on the farm. And we have 2 sizes, pretty standard, a full share and a half share. And all the details about that are on the website, but we do have over 20 pickup locations in Houston, mostly in central Houston, and also in the Heights in Southwest Houston, near to where our farms are. And we do offer delivery to specific zip codes within those geographic areas. And the details are on the website.
Okay, does anybody have any questions upcoming? Feel free to unmute yourselves or to put in the chat. Mariana Wood has asked, the farmers coordinate with faith bases?
Could you elaborate? I guess if I'm interpreting this right, we are not a religiously affiliated organization. We do have partners who are. So one of our farms is owned by the Braeswood Assembly of God, and certainly we have gotten lots of support from faith-based organizations over the years, including like the Dominican Sisters, and but we don't explicitly seek out, I guess, religious organizations.
There's also a comment from Mariana saying, this sounds like very nutritious food, which it does indeed. I'm looking at those hibiscus flowers and thinking about my favorite herbal teas.
Yeah, and Houston is such a cool place to farm because we get to grow year round, which in the US is very strange. In most of the US there's winter, and that precludes you from growing during those months. But in Houston we can grow all year, and we have kind of this extra season, which is the deep summer. And because of that, we can grow kind of tropical crops. So we have actually over 70 crops that we grow during a growing year, which
that is amazing.
It is an incredible diversity of crops, and it gives you an opportunity to learn about diverse food cultures, because maybe in the US we don't cook with molokhia, but in Egypt you'll find this great corner of the internet of Egyptian teenagers arguing over whose mom has the best molokhia soup. Like it really is a food journey that you get to go on.
Sounds amazing. Do please, guys, at least check out Planet Forward's website and look at some of the awesome work that they are doing. Bill Bryson was talking about how many grains we don't actually eat. Yeah, we do have kind of a narrower food culture than we have in the past, and you should feel free, but we are obviously working to diversify it with awesome organizations like Planet Forward. And Rachel has just been kind enough to put in the chat the email info@plant-it-forward.org. That way you guys can send an email and ask any further questions that you would like to, and get some awesome information about Planet Forward and maybe some of their affiliate organizations that they work with around the city of Houston. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us this morning and for giving such an in-depth look at Houston foodways and agriculture. Not being native to this state myself, I'm from Kentucky, so obviously the agriculture is a lot different. It was really interesting to get to know what the local food systems look like here, and how history and trends in food are crossing over with how globalized and international our world is becoming, and what wonderful opportunities we have for supporting our communities and for enjoying some fantastic local diverse food. And I did notice on you guys' website that you guys are actually a really big restaurant supplier as well. So you may be eating some of their produce if you are eating local in the restaurant sense as well. If you're not, like me, if you're not the best cook in the world, there are ways to enjoy it that way as well. So do please look up their organization and further information about Planet Forward. Consider volunteering or donating. Thank you so much for coming out and giving us a real slice of life in terms of agriculture and farming. And next week, we are going to have me. I'm going to be talking about graphic novels and giving you guys some recommendations for graphic novels, because July is graphic novels month. So we're going to be talking about the history and where graphic novels come from and what types of graphic novels there are and what, is recommended out there in different genres, because it's actually a lot broader of a sense than you think. There are actually a couple of good graphic novels about farming out there that we may include with this. But again, thank you guys so much for coming to Life at Noon, and we will see you all around.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.